An employee checks into a hotel. They connect to the Wi-Fi and open their laptop, and they get signed out of Microsoft 365. Well, they sign back in with the same prompt they've seen 1,000 times. But in the background, an attacker just walked away with valid credentials. But the key thing is there was no phishing email, no malicious link that a user needed to click, or a suspicious attachment. Well, that's the campaign that we're unpacking on today's episode.
Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Alexandra Moore, Threat Intelligence Manager.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. Now, today's episode is focused on a new campaign that our threat research team just published a report on. A lot of great research coming from our team here. And in this report, they unpack how threat actors were compromising hotel and conference center Wi-Fi gateways to silently harvest Microsoft 365 credentials from traveling corporate employees.
Yes, I'm really interested to delve into this one and discuss it on the podcast today, because what's really interesting about this whole situation is that it's not really a phishing story in the way that we usually cover them. So as you mentioned at the top of the episode, there's no email lure, there's no user click, there's no endpoint compromise. And essentially the attacker sort of owns the network that the employee is sitting on, and that's really enough for them to carry out their objectives.
Yeah, can't wait to unpack it here. And our team has tracked this activity since at least June of 2026, with compromised gateways identified across multiple cities in the United States and even internationally in countries such as India and Saudi Arabia. Also, the tradecraft overlaps with APT28, who is a known Russian military intelligence group that goes by names such as Fancy Bear or Forest Blizzard. Now, they were behind a similar campaign called Frost Armada that was disrupted back in April.
Yeah, so today we're going to break down how this attack works, why the DNS controls that most organizations already have don't actually stop it, and of course, most importantly, the controls that do. So let's jump straight into it. John, why don't you begin by walking our listeners through what our team found? So start off with the mechanics. So who's being targeted and how does the attack actually get started?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the compromised devices that we investigated were captive portal appliances, or the Wi-Fi gateways that you see at things like hotels, conference centers, and hospitality venues. Now, these attacks could also extend to Wi-Fi at places like airports, co-working spaces, universities, healthcare facilities, and other event venues. Now, we assess with low to medium confidence that the attackers got initial access by exploiting exposed management interfaces. So the things like internet-facing SSH and SNMP, as well as web administrator consoles. Now that in combination with weak or reused administrative credentials likely gave them that initial access into those devices. And that methodology is consistent with what has been previously documented in that other campaign we mentioned, Frost Armada.
All right, excellent. So we've covered the sort of initial access part of it. So once the attackers are in, what does the access that they've got actually give them?
Well, the quick answer is everything they need. Now, because these gateways serve as the DHCP assigned DNS resolver for every guest that connects, and you can really think about DHCP really as the system that hands out access for everything that connects to the network, helps to get to the internet. Well, that admin access alone is enough to start redirecting traffic at scale. The attackers don't need to touch a single endpoint here because they have that backend control. And from that position, the attacker can configure DNS response forgery. So when, for example, when your device queries a legitimate site like microsoftonline.com to log in, the gateway silently answers with an attacker-controlled IP address instead and serves a malicious login page as a result. Now, we've identified 4 different attacker-registered domains being used for this Microsoft impersonation, and the pattern is something like m365-owa.com, or for example, owa-m365.com, as well as others. Now, all these domains were hosted on the same 2 IP addresses and operated by the same actor based on the shared registration details.
So to sort of clarify what you're saying there, the user is going to think that they're on the real Microsoft login page.
Exactly. And that's one of the elements that makes this so dangerous. So when they enter those credentials, the threat actor just harvests them on the back end. Now, from there, the credentials will likely end up for sale on criminal marketplaces and forums, with low level access credentials going for as little as $10, and privileged access, like administrator credentials, going for upwards of thousands of dollars, if not being used very quickly in a turnaround attack against the organization. Now, we've also seen this campaign evolve with some of the latest tactics, and I'm sure you at home listening are very aware of device code phishing, as we've mentioned it a bunch. But this campaign also included a subset of cases where we saw device code phishing. And so, just a quick reminder, in that device code phishing, from the user's perspective, it looks like a normal Microsoft sign in or authorization prompt. And once they approve it, the attacker's in. And they often do so because they're mid workflow and they just want to get back to their work. But what they can't see is that it actually is providing the attacker direct access to the environment. And Microsoft is issuing them a valid OAuth token because it's a legitimate authentication flow.
All right, thank you for that. So what that results in is essentially the attacker ends up with harvested credentials, or even worse, MFA satisfied access to Microsoft 365.
Exactly, exactly. It's a dangerous attack chain.
Yeah, certainly is. But good that we're raising awareness of it for everyone listening, like you say. And then I think the other part that I wanted to dig into is that you mentioned that this whole activity campaign could potentially tie back to a Russia linked group called APT28. How direct is that link? Like what level of confidence do we have there?
Yeah, so attribution is still unclear overall, but the tradecraft does overlap with that previous campaign we mentioned, Frost Armada. Specifically, the gateway level DNS poisoning targeting Microsoft authentication domains and Soho or small office home office, as well as gateway devices for that initial access vector. Then they pair that with adversary in the middle Microsoft 365 account compromise. And all of that appears in the prior attacks we've seen from APT 28. But there are also some differences here, including the targeting of the captive portal appliances at hotels and conference centers. That was not previously documented. The infrastructure here, we identified the domains and the IP addresses. They don't align with prior APT activity. And in that Frost Armada campaign specifically, the attackers selectively redirected the traffic using keywords, whereas in this campaign, all DNS requests are resolved to the malicious infrastructure.
All right. So you're saying that the assessment is resting on TTP overlap rather than any shared infrastructure or code reuse that we've noticed.
Yeah, exactly. And really, at minimum here, it is tradecraft being reused.
But when you talk about techniques, there was also a secondary technique that was observed that you that we covered in the report, that was WPAD abuse. So why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, certainly. So, in about one third of the cases we saw in this campaign, Windows devices that hadn't disabled WPAD allowed attackers to attempt web proxy auto discovery abuse, which is WPAD. For context, WPAD is a Windows feature that automatically retrieves proxy settings when a device joins a network. Now, it checks a DHCP option first and then does a DNS lookup for a host named WPAD. In this case, both of those are controlled by an attacker. So if WPAD succeeds, then Windows retrieves a malicious proxy auto configuration file that routes most application traffic, things like standard web browsing through Chrome, core authentication components, and most enterprise applications using Windows networking, all through the attacker's proxy. Now, that massively broadens the redirection potential here beyond just authentication traffic.
Yeah, and that's another divergence from Frost Armada that we should point out. WPAD abuse wasn't featured in that prior reporting on the Frost Armada campaign.
Yeah, exactly. That's another element here, kind of muddying the water of the attribution towards APT 28.
Yeah, exactly. Never straightforward, is it? And then one last thing that really stood out to me from the report, the last thing that I want to highlight before we move on to discuss the problem in detail, is the operator panel that our team found.
Yeah, so on July 23rd, our team observed website content hosted under one of the malicious domains, ms365-device.com, that appeared to be an attacker administration panel for a web server. Very similar to what we found in our report on the Jalisco web panel. In this case, it was a different one. And it had functionality to upload and serve HTML pages, rotate Lua pages in either a fixed or random mode, manage downloadable files, track visitor telemetry, and restrict access to the panel through an IP allow list. Now, that's a very sophisticated and actively maintained piece of infrastructure, and its presence as recently as July 23rd really suggests that the campaign is still very active. That was only a week ago. All right, so we kind of set up the scene around the campaign, but Alex, let's kind of start breaking down the challenges here and why it's such a difficult problem for defenders. As I read through this report, what really stuck out to me is I imagine most organizations think they have defenses in place around this. A lot of these attacks seem kind of trivial credential harvesting. But as we unpack this, I think they'll find that the defenses still have gaps.
Yeah, exactly. There are real nuances to this, and that's why it's so good to be talking about it and outlining it for you all listening. So if we start off with the structural part of this, it's essentially just the fact you can't get away from that traveling employees are just fundamentally vulnerable. You've got the fact that your security team has got no control over remote Wi-Fi, like the ones used by hotels or conference centers, airports, cafes, co-working spaces, that type of thing. And that attack surface is just going to exist every time your employees travel, every time they go out of the office. And it just grows every time someone books a new business trip.
Yeah, and really, when we look at this specific attack, one of the things that makes it so difficult is that it doesn't require user interaction here. In the last few episodes, we've talked about things like phishing or the voice phishing, click fix, as well as other phishing kits. And all of those really require the user to do something. Click a link, paste a command, take a phone call. And this campaign doesn't require any of that. A single compromised gateway that's outside of your network puts every employee on that network at risk, regardless of how security savvy the individual actually is.
Yeah, and I think this is where a lot of security teams are going to hear this and think, well, we've got DNS security controls in place. We're absolutely fine. But the reality is that most common DNS protections don't stop this activity.
Yeah, and that's another great point. So if your device has a hard-coded resolver, for example, like Google's 8.8.8.8, their DNS server, then you might assume that you're safe because you're not using the hotel's DNS. But it's an important piece where you have to realize there are still gaps. For example, the request still leaves the device as unencrypted traffic that the compromised gateway can read, forge, and redirect. The gateway sees a request or a DNS request specifically going to that Google DNS server. It intercepts it and responds with the attacker's IP before it ever gets to Google.
Yeah, of course. And then endpoint DNS encryption tools also have a similar gap, as I understand it.
Yes, they do. So, and this one's a bit more subtle here. So, most DNS encryption tools default to what's called a opportunistic mode. And that means if the encrypted resolution fails for any reason, the tool falls back to a plain text DNS resolution. And that plain text fallback is exactly what the gateway can forge. So an organization might think it's protected, but because the DNS is actually in opportunistic mode, then the fallback path is still open.
Yeah, and then there's the whole device code flow aspect, which increases the potential for damage of this campaign, really. So, as we've mentioned before, device code phishing, it tricks users to authenticate and complete MFA that then grants the attacker access. And this just makes one of the best defenses against credential attacks, MFA, effectively obsolete. And I know that this is the second episode in a row where device code abuse has come up. So, it's really topical, really hot right now. Between Helix using it in phishing attacks and now APT28-Adjacent activity using it downstream of DNS poisoning, it just feels like another example of why it's quickly becoming one of the most abused authentication paths we track, and something that's really trending at the moment. The last piece that I want to flag is that WPAD abuse that we've spoken about, because it's really stealthy in a way that makes it particularly hard to detect. Proxy traffic is generated through a malicious PAC file, and it looks just like routine HTTPS network connections in logs. So that means that without really specific visibility into proxy authentication behavior, it's just going to blend in and defenders aren't going to notice it.
Yeah. And really want to re-stress again here that the campaign infrastructure is still active, right? We saw that operator panel as recently as July 23rd, and it hasn't been taken down. So there are new victims connecting to compromised gateways as we record this episode.
Yeah, exactly. Crucial one to be speaking about this week, and that's why we scheduled it in, right? We were going to maybe discuss something else, but we thought this was something that was really timely to talk about at the moment. So, to recap the problem that we've spoken about so far, we have this critical attack surface that exists outside of your control. We have common DNS protections that don't stop it. MFA, another relied on protection that doesn't stop the device code variant of it. We've got WPAD abuse that is really hard to see in logs, and the campaign is ongoing. That seems like an awful lot to defend against, seems like really bad news, but actually good news is that there are controls that close the gaps, and we're going to get into what all of those are just after the break.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
All right, we are back. So, John, our team is really clear in the report, thankfully, that there is one primary control that essentially neutralizes this campaign. Doesn't happen very often where we can give such specific advice, but this is one of those cases. So, why don't we start there?
Yeah, it's a solid recommendation. And if you've been halfway listening throughout this episode, this is the major takeaway here. This is the point to really hone in on. So the single most effective control here is enforcing an always on VPN with a full tunnel configuration on every corporate device. And we would need to be really precise about what that means, because a lot of organizations think that they have it and they don't. A full VPN tunnel routes all traffic, including DNS, through the corporate network before it ever reaches the hotel or the public gateway. So when your employee connects to hotel Wi-Fi, the DNS query for that legitimate MicrosoftOnline.com never is able to touch the hotel's DNS resolver. It's encrypted inside the VPN tunnel and resolved by your corporate DNS. So the attacker controlled gateway has nothing to forge.
Yeah, and really want to emphasize the always on part there, because that matters just as much as the full tunnel part of the recommendation.
Yeah, and that's a great point to call out, because the VPN needs to turn on automatically on a network connection and have supplemental controls that prevent internet access until the tunnel is active. Otherwise, you leave a window, sometimes only a few seconds, where the device is on the hotel network itself without the tunnel active, and that's enough for a DNS query to leak out and get poisoned.
Yeah, and to add on top of that, the tunnel itself can also introduce gaps. So we really need organizations to be auditing for split tunneling exceptions.
Yeah, so there's another strong piece to emphasize here. A lot of enterprise VPN configurations have a split tunnel exception for performance reasons. And this can be things like sending, traffic like Zoom calls and Teams and Microsoft 365 directly to those websites and tunneling everything else through the VPN. However, if any of those exceptions cover DNS or authentication traffic, then this attack still works against you. So every exception you have here really needs to be reviewed with this campaign in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second control that I would really emphasize here is one that we actually discussed in the Helix episode as well. And it applies just as much here as it did there. So this is all about device code phishing, that part of the attack. And it's essentially to disable the device code authentication flow at the identity provider. So John, let's break this down a little bit. Most of our listeners are probably already aware of this, but just quickly walk us through it for those that aren't. A bit of a quick reminder here.
Yeah. So the quick action is in Microsoft Entra ID. You can configure a conditional access policy that blocks the device code flow. The flow was designed for input constrained devices, things that it's hard to enter a password on, like smart TVs and IoT devices, but at the end of the day, it has very few legitimate use cases for most enterprise users in most environments.
Yeah, brilliant. And this is where these two attack chains actually converge. So Helix uses device code abuse in that initial phishing call that we saw from that threat actor. But this DNS poisoning campaign uses device code abuse as the account compromise mechanism, right downstream of the gateway compromise. So we've got the same authentication flow, but two very different initial access paths. And that one conditional access policy that you mentioned neutralizes both. So something that we really do want people to listen to and prick their ears up here.
Exactly. And that's really why it's worth mentioning again, because it's one high level, I should say high leverage control that is allowing for defense against multiple campaigns. So another reminder, if you haven't done an audit of who's permitted to use device code authentication in your environment, it should be on your to-do list this week. And then from there, block the flow by default and start granting exceptions only when there is a real justified business need for it.
Yeah, excellent. Really solid advice there. And beyond that, beyond these two headline controls that we just talked about, there are two other lower profile but still really important defenses that I want to cover in this episode. So let's first talk about the WPAD neutralization.
Certainly. So it's important to understand that WPAD itself is enabled by default on Windows. And in most enterprise environments, it really isn't needed. So if your organization doesn't require automatic proxy discovery, then you can disable WPAD via a group policy. Specifically, look for the Win HTTP Auto Prox SVC setting, and that eliminates the entire secondary redirection channel that we saw in about 1/3 of those cases. Now, if WPAD is required, then you can restrict the PAC or the PAC file retrieval to approved internal host only. You shouldn't be letting Windows pull a proxy configuration from an arbitrary host that could come from a compromised gateway.
And that same principle applies on the DNS encryption side as well, because strict mode encrypted DNS is the other strong recommendation that we want to highlight here.
Yes, certainly. So if you deployed DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, then you should check the mode. We mentioned that opportunistic mode earlier, and that's the default for most tools. And its gap is that it allows plain text fallback when encrypted resolution fails. So strict mode disables that fallback entirely. If your tools are running in opportunistic mode, then the gateway can still cause encrypted resolution to fail and force the fallback and then forge the plain text response from there. Strict mode really closes the gap here.
Excellent. So moving on from that, a question that I know all of you listeners are going to be having is, well, how do I actually hunt for this in my environment, right? Like these recommendations are things are great going forward, but what about if something has already happened? John, walk us through where to look on the hunting side of things.
Certainly. So there are a few high value signals here that you at home can start looking for in your networks. The first is going to be auditing for proxy authentication logs, specifically looking for authentications coming from unknown hosts. If you're seeing authentication traffic that's routed through proxy hosts you don't recognize, well, that's a really strong signal for active credential harvesting via a rogue proxy. Now, the second area is in the DNS traffic itself. You can look for anomalous DNS responses, especially resolutions to domains similar to what our team published in the report, or really things that look like they are mimicking legitimate Microsoft 365 domains. Some of the ones we called out were things like ms365-device, ms365-live, etc. There are also some associated IP addresses in the report that are great for hunting artifacts, and they can go into your intelligence feed to be ready for detection content immediately.
Yeah, brilliant. And then once you detect it using all of that hunting advice that you've just outlined there, containment really needs to be fast. I mean, when does it not? But in this instance, it does really need to be fast.
Yeah, exactly. This is a great use case for automated response playbooks here. And there's 4 that we'd call out specifically. You can isolate a host here to cut off any active WPAD proxy sessions. You can disable a user account to prevent credential replay, as well as terminate live sessions to stop the attacker access, which is very important for the device code flow. And then finally, delete device. As we've seen, attackers are registering devices for additional persistence on accounts. So automated play that removes those registered devices can stop that persistence from, that threat actor from regaining access to the environment via persistence.
Brilliant. And then finally, after all of that, even with all of these controls in place that we've just spoken about, there is a human awareness piece that we should mention as well.
Yeah, exactly. It never hurts to keep your employees informed, as they are often the first line of defense here. So employees should be trained to verify the URL of any page that's requesting credentials, particularly when they are connected in these remote locations like hotels, conference centers, airports, or other public Wi-Fi networks. Even with a full tunnel VPN policy being enforced, that awareness helps closes the gap here for edge to cases where things might fail. The VPN client could fall short to start. Someone could connect on a personal device, a device that could fall out of policy and no longer have the defenses in place. So really, this is just extra defense in depth here, but not a replacement for the technical controls.
Yeah, I think that's a really great call out. It's the two of them working together, right? The security team cannot prevent everything on their own, so they need that awareness and they need that help from all the other end users in the enterprise, really. Excellent. So why don't we pull this back? We're getting towards the end of the episode, so let's recap what you can actually do with everything that we've spoken about. We've given quite a few recommendations, but really just to summarize it for everyone to go away with, I'm going to start off with the security leaders. So if you are a CISO or a security leader listening to this, the strategic question that this episode is really challenging you to ask is essentially a mobility question. So your travel policy and your identity architecture really need to be designed with the assumption that the network your employees are going to connect to during their travels is going to be actively hostile. A bit like that sort of zero trust attitude that we always recommend. And the campaign that we've discussed in this episode proves that this extends beyond just how these employees access your organization's network remotely when they're away from the office, but also how they're accessing even basic resources like Microsoft Office and things like that. And the good news here, as we've outlined, is that you don't need a huge program to address it. You just need 2 policy decisions. So the first tomorrow morning action that I have for you is to pull your VPN configuration and confirm 2 things. One, that always on full tunnel VPN, so that's always on full tunnel, that needs to be enforced on every single corporate device. And then the second action is that split tunneling exceptions have been audited with this campaign in mind. Any exception that's going to allow DNS or authentication traffic to bypass the tunnel is a real gap. And then after that piece, it's the conditional access review. So you need to be asking your identity team who in our environment is permitted to authenticate via the device code flow, and what is the business justification for each of those accounts. As we've said, device code phishing does not seem to be going away. It seems to be the new thing that we're all dealing with. So you really want to make sure that you're protected and only allow that for the type of accounts that really do need it.
Yeah, those are some great recommendations. So for our operators here, I have 2 tomorrow morning actions for you. Number 1 is going to be around that user awareness here. So I would build a short and targeted awareness training for your traveling employees that they can reference this week. It really doesn't need to be a full training module. I think a one-page email or a small slide deck is enough. Cover a couple things. One, that hotel conference and airport Wi-Fis should be treated as hostile networks. And if they see an unexpected Microsoft 365 sign-in or device code prompt while they're on the road, they should really slow down and review the URL for red flags rather than quickly approving it. Now, I'd send that training to your frequent travelers and your executives first. Number 2, audit your endpoint configurations for WPAD status and your encrypted DNS mode. If WPAD is enabled and you don't need it, you can disable it via group policy. And if your DNS encryption is running in opportunistic mode, flip it over to strict mode. Now, those are 2 configuration changes that eliminate a significant portion of the attack surface in the campaign we've outlined today. Both of them are actionable tomorrow morning. Hotel Wi-Fi is no longer just a risky network. It's an active credential harvesting channel. Enforce always-on full tunnel VPNs, disable the device code flow, and treat every public network your employees connect to as hostile. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to read the full report, it's available in the link tree below. And as a reminder, you can give us some feedback via the survey in that link tree as well. And we're still always available at shadowtalk@reliaquest.com if you'd like to send us an email. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.